Take Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, the three belligerents, put them into a bucket. Collectively, they are the world's largest supplier of everything in the first column, second largest for the second column, and so on. Now, we're going to go through a number of these that are of interest to Manitoba, but first I want to go through the ones that are not, just so you have an idea of scale that we're dealing with here. First of all, aluminum. Unlike most of the mineral products that the Russians produce, they actually don't have any bauxite. So the aluminum process is you mine the bauxite, you basically run a current through it until you get a white powder called alumina, and then you transfer that to another facility where it's turned into the aluminum metal. When the Soviet system collapsed, they had all of this spare industrial capacity, and they started exporting things like steel. But they never had any aluminum at all. So what they did is they actually built the facilities post-Soviet to turn bauxite and alumina into aluminum using their spare electricity generation capacity. And they imported all of their bauxite and alumina from other countries. They get 2/3 of it from Ireland and Australia, which have stopped selling it. So this is an industry that is in the process of dying, and the Russians are the world's third largest source. Titanium is weird because the ore for the titanium comes from Ukraine, but the processing is done in Russia. So that's already gone to zero. The single largest user of Russian titanium, Airbus. Guess who has a country that is with an aerospace company that's now a subsidiary of Airbus? You guys. Neon's a fun one. Okay, back in 1983, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan were kicking it in Iceland, and they decided to get rid of nuclear weapons. And at the last second, Gorbachev said something along the lines of, if we're going from tens of thousands of nuclear weapons each to just a few dozen, which is great, by the way, you need to give up on that giant space satellite laser shield that you keep talking about. Star Wars has got to die, otherwise it won't be fair. Reagan said something very Reagan-like along the lines of, I didn't realize that you thought life was fair. And that was the end of the discussion. So Gorbachev goes home, convinced that giant space lasers were the future of great power competition, and orders out the construction of the supply chain that will be necessary to build and supply them. Neon was part of that. Neon is used in the apertures of the lasers to help focus the beam. Now, this system was built out successfully. The Soviet Union collapsed a few years later before they ever launched the satellites. And we now use that neon to focus the apertures of a different kind of laser on a smaller scale. The lasers in semiconductor fab facilities that do the etching process. No neon, no semiconductors. 80% of global neon comes from the former Soviet world, or it did. The first phase of neon production is done at steel mills, where there's something called an air separation unit that separates out oxygen and nitrogen, which you then blow into the foundry to get the temperature quotient you want. And that extra stuff goes into an extra canister, which goes to a different, more advanced facility where they extract all the trace gases, the argon, the helium, the carbon dioxide, the neon. The first phase, the air separation units, those were all at steel facilities in southern Russia, which are shutting down because of sanctions. The second phase, the purification, was done in part in Odessa, which hasn't had reliable power for 6 months, but most of it was done in Mariupol, which is now leveled. We have already lost 80% of global supply, which means that probably within a year, we're going to have to decide what has to go back to analog. This is the one that I worry about the most personally. I deal with a lot of different economic sectors, transport, manufacturing, energy, but agriculture is what we need to make everything else work. 40% of global potash comes from Belarus and Russia specifically, and it is very questionable in my mind whether Russia's potash producing facilities and processing facilities can be managed by the Russians themselves. Most of their advanced technological stuff that is required to make a modern system run, especially in things like petrochemical and minerals processing, is not provided by the Russians. It's Western labor and tech that is brought in, and that has, in essence, gone to zero. There are huge portions of the world, most notably South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia. They don't have a single scrap of potash at all. Luckily for us in North America, we have you. Canada is the world's single largest supplier. Most of that comes from Saskatchewan. A little bit of that comes from Manitoba. If I were you, I would double, triple, and quadruple down on that because the world is going to need a lot more than we can get. And if you start right now, it'll come online in 10 years. So we have a lot of famine in front of us, even if we get going today. Okay, energy. This is a pipeline map. We're going to look first at the green lines. Those are the oil pipes. The places that matter are these two ports right here. In the north, you have the port of Primorsk on the Baltic, and in the south, you have the port of Novorossiysk on the Black. What's going on is the Europeans, the Canadians, and the Americans have banned insurance on all Russian vessels. And I know, you guys you got me up at 9 o'clock to talk about insurance. Just bear with me. Insurance is becoming a very exciting space. For shipping, if you don't have a maritime insurance policy, you cannot enter port, exit port, or go into any constrained waterway like, say, the Panama Canal. So it's a big deal. In a part to get around this, the Russians are offering direct sovereign indemnifications, but you may have heard they're a little cash shy. And if something happens to a boat, it's about $1 billion payout. So assuming you're willing to suck up the price increase on the crude, there's a vested interest for a lot of countries to grab a Russian ship or two just to force the Russians to pay. Now the Chinese, in order to still get Russian crude, leased a half a dozen supertankers and have lashed them together in a raft in the North Atlantic off the coast of Portugal. And they're using shuttle tankers to access these two ports. They're relatively shallow, so you can't get a super tanker in there. And shuttling those tankers out to Portugal and doing sea-to-sea transfers. Now there's no end of ways that this can go horribly wrong and trigger an insurance event. You can have a sea-to-sea accident because it's dangerous. You could have a country like Latvia just decide to snab one of them as they're going by. All of this would stop stuff from loading at the port. And that becomes very important very quickly because the Russian oil patch isn't like Texas. It's more like northeastern Manitoba. It's in the permafrost. And as you folks know, in the winter, as long as you are moving, you are fine. But if you stop, you freeze to death. Same with oil. If the ports can't discharge cargo, pressure builds up in the ports all the way back to the pipes, all the way to the wells in Siberia, and then the oil freezes in the pipes as it goes through the permafrost. The water that comes up as a byproduct turns to ice, and when water turns to ice, it expands and it busts the pipe from the inside out. The last time this happened in Russia was 1992, and it took the Russians 30 years to bring it all back online. Only it wasn't the Russians who brought it back online. It was the Western services firms operating in Russia, which are now almost completely gone. So all we need is one or two events with shipping or with insurance, and we lose about 4 million barrels a day of Russian crude all at once. And as you guys know, the pricing for oil and for fuels and electricity does not follow normal supply and demand. If you need a liter of gasoline to get to work and you can only get 3/4 of a liter, not only will you pay whatever you have to do to get that last quarter, whatever price you pay for that last little bit applies to the entire market. The marginal supplier sets the price. So if we lose 4% of global crude because of the Russians, we can easily have crude hit $180 a barrel. And it won't come back because this Russian stuff will be offline for decades. Same map, we're going to look at the red lines now. The red lines are natural gas, and this is the one that really matters. About 3 weeks ago, someone blew up this pipeline. This is the Nord Stream line. It goes from mainland Russia under the Baltic Sea directly to Germany with no transit states in between. It was responsible for 40% of German natural gas sourcing. So they didn't lose a marginal supplier. They lost their prime supplier. And they're attempting to replace those volumes with 7 different marginal suppliers. So of course natural gas prices in Germany are 6 times what they are in North America. People are only now starting to game this forward to indicate what it means. Americans are pretty agnostic about where we get our energy. We get it from Canada, we make some ourselves, we get some from Mexico, we get some from Saudi Arabia. If no one's looking, maybe we get a little bit from Venezuela. It's not how the Germans are. The Germans are in a much more constrained environment, and so they have to have a plan in order to keep the lights on. So they cut deals with state-owned companies whenever they can because they believe that that's more reliable. They bring in large volumes, and the natural gas doesn't simply provide the basis for the German electricity system, but also for the German industrial system. They use that natural gas for their petrochemical sector, and then the petrochemicals don't get exported. It's all kept in-house, and it forms the basis for their manufacturing works. Well, they've lost the first step. No natural gas, no petrochemicals, no manufacturing. If you want a beamer, you should probably go out and get it, because this is probably going to be the last one. The German industrial base is going to collapse over the course of the next year and a half. It gets worse because this is the German backup plan. Pipelines that transit the conflict zone in an artillery war. We're probably going to be looking at the Germans losing roughly 2/3 of their total natural gas needs, and there's no way their economic model can survive that.